Hi, welcome to the first module of the School Safety Planning and Implementation in the context of systemic risks and in accordance with the commitments of the 2030 Agenda of the Resilient Schools and Disaster Risk Reduction Education. So the first module, it's going to be composed by different subparts. The first part will be talking about an introduction to school safety, what is important and what has been the impacts on the educational facilities, but also on the education systems. So we're going to be talking about physical impacts, on school facilities, but also on students and staff, including teachers. We're going to be talking about the education impacts on students and also the psychological impacts that we will have there. Then we're going to pass to module 1.2, where we're going to talk about the elements that link school safety in the 2030 Agenda, the international architecture for schools, for safe schools, and linking the humanitarian development agenda. And we're going to finish this module 1 with making the economic case for safe schools. But now we're going to start only doing a small introductions about what is going to be or what are the impacts of all hazards, including societal hazards, natural hazards, and socio-natural hazards on educations and schools. So just to give you a little bit an overview about what has been the impact of disasters, and this graphic only talk about those that are coming from natural origins. So only in 2019, and based on the International Federation of Red Cross, we have more than 308 disasters that were triggered by natural hazards, on which one we have more than 127 floods, many earthquakes, some epidemics, and this is before COVID, and some landslide and extreme temperature events. Those disasters has been really impacted the African region very, very considerable. If we see this map that has been produced by UNDRR and that was launched last year, we see that at least 7 of the African countries has suffered the most. We are in the top 10 of the countries that has suffered in number of inhabitants for 100,000 in the last century, including and highlighting the case of Ethiopia, with more than 46 million people suffering for specific natural hazards. But also we have issues like in Mauritania, in Lesotho, in Zimbabwe, in Somalia, etc. And we have to see that all of this information that we're going to be discussing later on is really not sufficient because all this data hasn't been provided. So we have not a good representation of what actually is happening on the field. So saying this, just to give you a good understanding on that. So worldwide, we have 1.2 billion of students that are enrolled in primary and secondary schools. Just to give you an example of that 1.2 billion, 900 million of school children live in high seismic risk zones. Could you imagine? It's a big proportion of our school children nowadays. And hundreds of millions of them, they really and regularly face flooding, landslides, extreme winds, and fire hazards worldwide. Just only to give you an example, between 2000 and 2010, more than 175 million were affected by climate-related disasters. So this is a big proportion, and this is why it's bringing us to this important subject of school safety. Similarly to that, in 2017, we can talk about that more than 40 million people were displaced due to conflict and violence, a very important societal hazard. And 18.8 million were forced to move, or they were they were moved for short periods, but also they were moved for longer periods. And these people were forced not only because of disasters, but also because conflict elements that affect their living. And this moving affect the education of our children and affect the education of many, many students worldwide. Just to give you also some practical information about what has happened, about what we know about the impacts at the global level of the natural and socio-natural hazards on education and schools. One of the wake-up calls, I'm just going to mention 4 here, But this main cause that has made the subject of school safety very important has been first one, the earthquake of 2008 in Sichuan, where more than 10,000 students died and there were more than 7,000 schools that collapsed, waking up all the international community to say, hey, look, we need to do something concerning this particular element that is school safety. We need to protect education system, we need to protect children at the school levels, but also staff, including teachers and administrative staff in the schools. In 2010, there was another second call with the earthquake of Haiti, a country that have never had a tradition of seismic activity, and for that many elements that could be prevented by strengthening building codes or by implementing specific policies were not in place. So therefore, schools were not really built in order to support any kind of seismicity in that sense. And there we have more than 38,000 students that died, 1,300 teachers and education personnel that died there. Even the infrastructure of the Ministry of Education on Haiti was destroyed, and more than 4,000 schools were really damaged. 80% of them, they were in Port-au-Prince, the capital of the country. In 2011, there was a third wake-up call about the importance of this topic. That was the Fukushima Japan earthquake and tsunami of 2011. On here, we get information about that more than 733 children and teachers died in schools during the tsunami. During the earthquake, there were no kids that died, but during the tsunami, there were many that died. And then with the Fukushima, so this cascade effect that the earthquake and tsunami produced in the nuclear crisis also originate that many children need to move from the area, interrupting or not having a continuity in their education and having an important issue here. And I want to highlight this because, we can see the example of China, and then we see the example of Haiti, and then we go to the example of Japan. So it doesn't matter if you come from a wealthy country, for a developed country, or a country that is in their development process. School safety is an issue worldwide, and it doesn't matter if there is a wealthy country or a poor country. There is something that we need to take into consideration worldwide, because nobody is out of, or nobody is except for the negative impacts that natural hazards and conflict can have on children and on education systems. The last one that we had concerning natural and socio-natural hazards has been in 2020 in Honduras. As you know, there were two storms and hurricanes, Eta and Iota, that really had an impact in the Honduras country, with more than 534 educational centers that were damaged and more than 10,000 students that were placed in shelters in more than 14 departments. And those shelters normally were schools, so making some complications on the continuity of the pedagogical process. I'm sorry for this confusion, for the pedagogical process in Honduras. So this is just to give you some examples about just in the 21st century how natural and socio-natural hazards has been impacted education children on schools. Just 4 elements about 4 different countries with different economic status and different kind of wealth worldwide. So similarly, passing from natural and socio-natural hazards to more societal hazards such as conflict. If we see today, we have more than 61 million primary school children that are out of school. And from these 61 million, there are 28 million that live in conflict-affected poor countries. And living in these countries are really having a repercussion on the education of these kids. 1/3 of the enrollments in secondary school are, the enrollment rates in secondary schools are nearly 1/3 lower in conflict-affected countries compared with others that are developed. And children in conflict-affected children in conflict-affected poor countries are twice as likely to die before their 5th birthday as children in poor countries. So this is something that needs to put a lot of attention on the people that is doing and developing the policy for school safety. Similarly, attacks on educational facilities have been increasing. Just only between 2005 and 2012, armed forces and groups have used schools for military purpose in at least 24 countries in conflicts. And schools has been converted in detention facilities, weapon depots, or barracks, and also children has been recruited by illegal groups, and they are interrupting their education and, of course, compromising their future and the future of their communities and societies. So I'm going to go a little bit more deeper on these impacts on education and schools. So we're going to start talking about the physical impacts on students and staff. So just in the 21st century, as you know, children spend more than 50% of their time in school facilities. And those school facilities in many places are not constructed or maintained, which is a very important element here to be disaster resilient. And what has produced is that only in the 21st century, over 30,000 schools has been completely destroyed due to latent hazard triggering disasters. And over 45,000 schools has suffered significant damage in the different impacts that natural hazard has produced over them. Only to give an example, in Bangladesh, earthquakes, storms, floods, and rising sea level damage approximately 900 schools per year on average, based on information that is provided by Save the Children on 2015. And concerning conflict, if we take into consideration the case of Nigeria, where we do the latest education needs assessment, it was found that 260 school sites has been damaged by bullets. They have been deliberately set on fire, more than 20% of them. And 29% of them had armed groups or military groups in close proximity, putting in risk the students that are in those schools. If we see this map is only for the 21st century, we can see that the impacts of natural hazards on school has been really increasing. And that depends on the periodicity of the specific hazards. But we can see that this is a problem that is worldwide. It's not something that is located, but it's affecting, as I was saying in the beginning, wealthy countries, but also poor countries. So this is something that we need to start working, and that has been recognized in the international agenda that we will talk on modules 1.2 and 1.3. So this is important for us to try to understand why school safety is important. Only to talk about the African context. So just in the 21st century, we are having many countries that from the north of Africa until the south of Africa has been suffered by the negative impacts of hazards. Earthquakes in Algeria in 2003 damaged a lot of schools, seriously damaged more than 122. Fires in Uganda, cyclones in Madagascar, floods in Malawi, conflict in Nigeria as well, for instance, not only natural hazards, but societal hazards displaced many teachers, so compromising the education of those qualified teachers that were in the country. In Ghana, high wind storms also produced in 2019 many problems with the schools. I want to highlight also another case here, that is the case of Nigeria in 2019, where for a lack of maintenance, 20 people died and 40 were injured, mostly children, when a 4-story building collapsed in Lagos. The building had been marked for demolition 3 times in the country, but no was a follow-up on this policy that was implemented there. So we didn't have to wait for a specific hazard to trigger a collapse, but the lack of maintenance produced this terrible catastrophe in the country. So this is something that not only happens in Nigeria. In Kenya, we have the same. 7 children died and 64 people have been injured after a school collapse in Nairobi. So we can see that it's not only related to natural hazards that are triggering these collapses, but it's also the lack of maintenance. So it's something that we need to start taking into consideration, because it's not only to prevent about natural hazards, but it's in the whole context of maintenance and securing safety in the schools. And as you know, 2020, with the COVID-19, many children were out of school. The schools were closed, and many of the children were forced to be connected to virtual classes or hybrid classes in many of the African countries, and some of them that didn't have connections, possibilities, or internet or IT facilities to connect and follow up the classes were really being out of schools, were left behind. And this is something that we need to take into consideration where we are trying to understand why it's important to start talking about school safety. So, some physical impacts on a student and staff. As you know, children represent more of between 50 and 60% of those that are affected after a specific disaster or conflict. And this is something that is very particular because we have always placed children in the vulnerable groups. Children doesn't have the physical capacities to overcome or to cope with any kind of hazard. So they are very vulnerable in that sense. Similarly, the perception of risk of children is completely different about the perception of risk that adults could have. So this is why place them in a specific vulnerable position when we have these specific hazards that may be triggering disasters in any of our countries. Worldwide, there has been at least 35 fatalities, so children that have died in only 16 events. So this is incredible, a huge number of kids just for specific natural hazard events. Millions of children also suffer lifelong injuries and disabilities due to disasters. So it's not only that they get affected, but also is the repercussions that they will have for the rest of their life due to the specific negative impacts of natural hazards on their education and on their life. Some out of 80 people are displaced within or across borders by conflict or natural hazard triggered disaster. And this is something that is very important to highlight because being displaced also stops the continuity of education and the learning outcomes really get jeopardized due to this. Now let's talk about the education impacts on students. One of the main issues that we have is about the management and coordination of education programs that normally when we have a disaster situation or a conflict situation really gets jeopardized. It can be very problematic to manage and coordinate a good education and to secure quality education because some of the times teachers have left the disaster area or the conflict area. We don't have the learning and teaching material. We have been lost, has been on fire, has been flooded. There are the books that has been destroyed. So we are, every time there is an impact on schools, we are also impacting the quality education of our children. And you know, sometimes conflict as well as disasters can exacerbate stereotypes that are already existing in some communities. So this is something that is not only on the students themselves, but in the education and on strengthening these links of community links of cohesion that we would like to have. So in conflict and disaster situations, it's very difficult to work on programs that can really reduce the stereotype. So there are some specific impacts on the education systems, as I just mentioned: management, coordination, quality education, and loss of learning and teaching material, and also other elements like the stereotyping. Only to give you one specific example that I mentioned before on the impacts of COVID-19 on education. The World Bank prepared a specific study that you see here in the slide, and they simulate the potential impacts of COVID-19 and the school closure on schooling and learning outcomes. And for instance, they realized that the loss of effective years of basic schooling is being reduced. Is being reduced, for instance, at the global level for 7.9 years to 7.3 years. And in the case of Africa, that was already particularly something that was particularly of the attention of decision makers, was going from 4.9 years to 4.7 years in the optimistic scenario. And in a pessimistic scenario, we are having a decrease for 4.9 years of effective instruction to 4.3 years, which is also going back on the different advancements that the African region was taken during the last years with the challenge that has been implied. Similar, the level of prophecy has been diminished in around 25. So there is a increase from 40% to 50% in the share of lower secondary age children who are below the minimum level of prophecy. So this is outcomes from these specific studies. And the World Bank has highlighted the fact that many girls, they became more vulnerable due to COVID because they have been also living out of schools and they have been affected with a bigger impact than boys, similar as persons with disabilities and other marginalized groups. At the same time, there is something that I will mention later, is about these closures of schools have increased the recruitment of children by illegal groups. And this is something that is really jeopardizing the future of communities, societies, and these specific kids. So, concerning the impacts on teachers, children, and youth. So, on teachers sometimes became targets for political violence, and sometimes they have been forced to do political indoctrination, and sometimes there are targets from different political groups in order to say that they are indoctrinating kids, or that they are putting the kids on a specific sides of the political spectrum in the country. And at the end, the teachers that are political actors, at the end, they are suffering this stigmatization. Teachers that normally don't have good salaries in some of the countries that are in conflict situations. Similarly, teachers suffer from physical and emotional trauma, and they rarely receive psychological support. And this is something that we need to start considering, because teachers, the psychological support is very important for teachers. They are not only teachers, they are human beings that also suffer from the trauma of conflict or disasters. And in some cases and in some countries, many teachers has been leaving the area, the geographical area where they are. And these are normally trained teachers. So to replace those teachers is a very complicated challenge that many ministers of education has to take into consideration and to cope with it. Similar on children and youth well-being. So as similar as the teachers, children suffer physical and emotional trauma. And as I mentioned, sometimes they are recruited by armed force, illegal armed force. And being out of school also have a repercussion on the information that is out of the pedagogical context. For instance, on providing important information on health that are required and that normally you get through the school. So being out of school also have implications on the health information and other information that they will need to live in the society and in their communities. Similar, the opportunities for children and youth. Normally, conflict and disasters increase poverty, and that increase of poverty also jeopardize the economic opportunities of these children, compromising the future opportunities as well as the learned skills that they need to contribute to society and to peaceful reconstruction and to the economic growth and the sustainability that they need, including facing the challenge of climate change. What are sometimes the psychological impacts on students and staff? As I have mentioned, psychological impacts are very important. Sometimes they have psychological impacts because they lost some relatives, family members, good friends in the school, friends in the community, in the neighbor. Sometimes they suffer psychological impacts because they lost their home, they lost the economic stability of their parents. Sometimes because of they lost the economic stability, they are forced to work in order to support their families. Sometimes they became a source of resources for the whole family and sometimes for the community. So they are forced to work due to the impact that disasters of conflict have on their education. So they are putting out of schools in order to support economically their families. Also, disaster may weakness existing programs and systems. For instance, on psychological support, on nutrition support, programs that normally are helping kids to get the nutrition that they don't get if they don't go to school. This is something that happened and that was reflected with COVID. many kids were having a good nutrition through the schools. When they are not going to schools at home because of the economic complications of some households, they couldn't get the necessary food to really have a good health, a good life health that they were expecting to have. So this is important for them to have, because as you know, the lack of nutrition can have also some impacts on the learning outcomes of kids, but also they can have some impacts on the health of kids and children and also individuals in the society. But not all of this is negative. We have seen examples on which, a culture of safety improve the capacity of children and societies to cope with the negative impacts of natural, socio-natural, and anthropogenic hazards or societal hazards. And this is, for instance, I wanted to talk of something that became very famous, that was the miracle of Kamaichi, that was in the East Japan earthquake and tsunami in 2011. So this Kamaichi city that was in the Iwate prefecture was devastated by the tsunami. More than 1,000 dead and missing persons after the tsunami came. But 90.8% of the students in elementary and junior high schools in the city survived. So most of the impacts were not on the kids and not on the children. And people started studying why this happened to them. And they realized that the city, together with the elementary schools and with the support of the academia, the Japanese university, were working together on improving drills, on improving hazard information, on improving the capacities and the availabilities and the abilities of children to understand hazards and to respond when the early warning was coming. So they increased their response capabilities and they were able to save their life, and they were able to really be secure and safe when the tsunami came. So there are positive things, and this is what we're going to be discussing in the other modules. So we saw all the negative impacts, we saw all the different elements that can affect school safety, like natural hazards, socio-natural hazards, societal hazards, but also we saw, and we're going to see during the next modules, that there are also positive things that can be done, because this is not something that cannot be prevented, something that cannot be mitigated. And this is why we are here in this course, is to try to understand what are the different elements that will create really resilient schools, disaster risk reduction education, and make societies safety and resilience in accordance with the agreements that we as an international community and as a local communities, we have agreed to work on that. So it has been a pleasure to discuss with you about this module 1.1. We're gonna pass to the next modules and we will see each other in the coming modules. Thank you for your attention.